The 900-line Sony BVM20F1U is arguably the best CRT for 240p gaming, and for good reason. Sporting super sharp visuals that will challenge even the sharpest scalers out there. However, it has one major hiccup. The fucker only supports standard def. Yes, folks, this razor-sharp monitor has a max resolution of 640 by 480i. It is simply a testament to how important standard definition used to be. But is 900 lines overkill for a CRT that cannot even support 480p? And does 900 lines actually benefit 240p content? Abso-fucking-lutely. As far as inputs, my specific BVM has two BKM21D cards and one analog RGB sync card. Now, the analog RGB sync card is absolutely a must. Without it, well, you're kind of fucked, as you need RGB plus sync to play your consoles in RGB 15 kHz. Now, the BKM21D supports composite, component, and a digital connection known as SDI, or Serial Digital Interface. It is possible for the BKM21D to support RGB that does not require a separate sync, but the only other type I am familiar with is RGB sync on green. Now, this is not to be confused for component YPB-PR, although technically you can use a component cable since all you need is the green output for sync. However, I prefer the SCART method for PS2 since most of its games run in 480i, which may require me to switch the external sync off for sync on green 480p. Alright, fun fact. Did you know you can actually run RGB 480p 31 kHz through a SCART? Well, with sync on green, it is in fact possible. Now, as far as I know, sync on green only supports 480p and higher. And although the BKM21D can support sync on green 480p, the 20F1U cannot support this resolution. However, the 24E1WU can. So what is RGB sync on green? It's basically progressive VGA minus the horizontal and vertical sync. And unlike component YPB-PR, where you have a limited color spectrum, RGB gives you the full spectrum and runs at a higher bandwidth. So as you can see, the blacks, the reds, and the blues are much more vibrant than its component counterpart. Anyways, just remember, in order to obtain RGB sync on green, both your console and your monitor must support it. So what about those who do not have sync on green support? Well, you can always get an Extron RGB203 like me, which can change sync on green to external sync for my XRGB Mini. Now, of course, it's a lot of fucking wiring to make this happen for a slightly better color spectrum. But for those who are interested, here are the comparisons.
Another system that actually supports sync on green is the original Xbox. This is actually the perfect system for sync on green since almost every game supports 480p. However, the original Xbox cannot display RGB sync on green natively. You will need to soft mod it and patch the BIOS, after which I was able to obtain an RGB sync on green through a component cable but not a SCART, which is fine since almost all Xbox games run in 480p. However, the original Xbox does not deliver VESA-compliant sync on green pulses. The VESA standard requires sync pulses with negative voltage. The problem is the Xbox cannot produce negative sync pulses, which may result in a slight color shift as you see here in Panzer Dragoon through the Extron and XRGB Mini. All the dark gray colors appear slightly red. Now this is not as relevant on my BVM, which means it all depends on how your equipment or monitor handles the non-VESA sync pulses. And in my opinion, the BVM is light years ahead of the XRGB Mini Extron Duo. Not to mention, it's way fucking easier to hook it up to the BVM. Later, I was able to run 720p RGB sync on green at 44.92 kHz, but the picture looked like shit through the Extron XRGB Mini Duo. So here is the BVM running 720p. I will say this is the best I have ever seen 720p. It's a shame I cannot capture it that well since there is too much black on the screen. Trying to record true blacks on a CRT is nearly impossible without underexposing everything else. Anyways, not many people seem to realize that RGB had actually progressed into high definition in many forms and in many names. And while RGB has become nearly obsolete in the analog world, it has in fact progressed into the digital world and simply referred to as color spaces. Now, the PlayStation 3 has options for full RGB through HDMI at 1080p, as well as the color space YCBCR, which is in fact the digital cousin of the analog YPBPR. Man, I fucking love this monitor. Anyways, to run sync on green through a SCART switcher, you must make sure it can in fact pass RGB sync on green. I actually found some SCART switchers that don't, mainly the ones that are auto switchers. However, manual switchers seem to work just fine. Now, my preferred method is the Extron matrix switcher. This monstrous beast is built like a tank and twice as ugly. However, it is the best switcher I have ever had, with the ability to switch between RGB sync, composite, component, RGB sync on green, and even VGA since it carries both horizontal and vertical sync. Now, while my BVM does not take VGA natively, the Extron 203 is a sync combiner, which means you can combine horizontal and vertical sync in order to display VGA with only one sync as opposed to two. Now, for those who don't know, VGA is actually RGB progressive 480p with both horizontal and vertical sync. Anyways, the Extron matrix switcher does prefer strip sync. This means you may have to purchase SCART breakout cables with a sync stripper built in. I got all mine from Wookie Win on eBay. Anyways, there is also no RGB degradation nor voltage bleed whatsoever. But again, it's ugly as fuck. To make my setup more manageable, I ended up purchasing a small 19-inch rack to mount this beast along with the Extron SW AV series. Basically a stereo switcher since I did not have the option, nor did I want to use those stupid Phoenix connectors. You may also notice I installed two 19-inch surge arresters. Cable management is a must for me, and I find keeping all AC outlets in one spot can help tremendously with this. Now, another feature of the Extron switcher is that it's not only a video switcher, but also a distribution device. So as you can see, I have 4 outputs. This means I can switch between 8 devices and display them on 4 separate monitors if I wanted to. I could even use one of the outputs for my XRGB Mini in order to record game footage. Alright, fun fact. Did you know that the NTSC Wii can actually display RGB sync through a SCART despite contrary beliefs? Well, it turns out that RGB not being available in the American Wii is really a software block. And in fact, it can display a very beautiful RGB picture on my BVM. However, this requires a soft mod and USB loader GX. You will then need a SCART to display a red screen that's similar to the Virtual Boy. It's easily navigated through despite its ugly appearance. There may even be a way to bypass the red screen altogether by installing newer BIOS. Anyways, you can execute USB Loader GX to load ISOs, or in my case, off my external hard drive and pick a game. After which, I go into game load settings, and in video mode, I choose Force PAL 60 Hz. This will enable RGB, and you will get a nice vibrant 480i picture that is considerably more colorful than component 480p, despite being a lower resolution. I actually stumbled across this trying to figure out a way to run Wii in RGB sync on green. But unfortunately, I could not find any documentation of someone actually pulling this off. So if anyone watching this video has any clue on how to obtain RGB progressive in either sync on green or VGA, please share that info. And yes, I know about that fake VGA cable for the Wii that just transcodes component to VGA. That is not the same, and it will not get you true results. Alright, since I didn't have a whole lot of time designated to the 20F1U, most of my CRT comparisons through the rest of this video will be the 20F1U. And before I start, I would like to give a big thanks to Bob from Retro RGB, who has given me the chance to review both the Ultra HDMI and the HIDEF NES.
It's me, Mario! Hello!
Oh! What you doing? You're playing on the 55!
Yes, Bubba, I'm playing on the 55.
Well, shit, sign me up! Yeah, looks like you get to play with the ugly joystick, dickhead.
Hey man, get your feet off my 20F1U. What the hell you call me?
You're such an idiot. I said 20F1U, not FU.
What the hell you call me?
Now, while I like to play on old game systems on an old CRT, I cannot deny that playing on an LCD in true digital without having to convert from analog and without an extra device to upscale does not seem tempting. Especially when it comes to the N64. I mean, just look at the 4 joystick ports in the front of the console. It tells me it's a party system, but there's no way in hell I'm gonna have 4 friends over in front of a 20-inch RGB monitor playing Mario Kart 64. Let's just be real, not everybody likes an RGB monitor. Ah, come on man, get your boots off the F1U! Play what? Play it again. Just let it go already. Oh hell, that shit looks awesome, dork. Pure digital all the way. I hate to be the one to break it to you, but this is the regular RGB mod running through the XRGB Mini, dumbass. Well, the shit looks good to me. Yeah, but Super Mario 64 never looked bad. As a matter of fact, Super Mario 64 is not as affected by the aliasing filter as most games because of the goo-rod shading, as I've explained in an earlier video. So that typically looks decent even though the aliasing is there. However, since Mario has such a huge face, we're going to use him as basically a before and after aliasing effect. I'm using a 4x integer scale because a windowed 960p is the closest integer scale you can get in 1080p without overscanning. Plus, it's the sharpest.
It's beautiful. Hallelujah. What now, asshole?
Now, to be quite honest, the first time I viewed an overpixelated Super Mario 64, I was not impressed. It just seemed like polishing a fucking turd. However, after playing it a considerable amount of time, I found myself liking it 1 minute and hating it the next. To my eyes, it just seemed overpixelated and not very pleasing. I love how the colors are a bit better, but it seemed more like amplifying the low saturation levels that the N64 is crippled with. Now take for instance Kirby 64. The colors are nice and bright, but they are not vibrant. They look like washed out colors being amplified to the very extreme. Now to be fair, none of this has anything to do with the Ultra HDMI mod. These issues are relevant to the N64's hardware in general. But now we know why Nintendo chose to put the filter in the first fucking place, and like I said, going digital is not going to change the N64's hardware flaws. So if you're expecting the cure for cancer, you're not going to find it here. You're just going to get a better look at it. Now, some of you might think the shifting pixels are caused by the Ultra HDMI Integer plus D-Blur settings. But these shifting pixels are actually relevant on a real CRT. They're just hidden behind an aliasing filter and some scan lines. Now, scan lines, in my opinion, also serve as an aliasing filter of some sort. And this is exactly the reason why PlayStation games look great, despite no aliasing filter. And only a person who would confuse sharpness with jagged pixelated graphics would disagree. Scan lines are as important on 3D games as 2D, in my opinion. Now the problem is we don't need aliasing when scan lines were simply already doing this job. However, the Ultra HDMI gives us the option for scan lines without the blur. And not just 720p, but 1080p without that shitty fucking blur. So basically, the D-Blur settings plus scan lines provides a happy medium for overpixelated games. However, there are instances when the fake scan lines are more of a distraction. Going back to Kirby, which in my opinion is one of the most stubborn games on the N64 to even look halfway decent, if you activate the scan lines, the image gets too dark. Now, while there are settings to make the scan lines thinner and less dark, I find those settings not very flattering either. I actually prefer black scan lines like a CRT. So, if I find that scan lines make the image too muddy or less colorful, I always revert to the integer settings. However, remember to disable the gamma boost or the image will be too bright. I only use gamma boost when activating scan lines. Now, before we get too far into scan lines, I just want to make sure everybody is watching in 1080p, and if you're watching on a TV, make sure it's unscaled. Alright, so let's talk about settings. Simply holding the LR, right D-pad, and C right, you can bring up the menu screen. Now, while there are a ton of options in the Ultra HDMI setup, I find myself using only 4, and this is game specific. If I choose not to activate scan lines, I use the integer or integer plus settings and always turn off the gamma boost. Now, integer basically refers to a perfect 4 times scale, while integer plus refers to a perfect 5 times scale that is overscanned much the same way an old CRT would have done it. Both, while super sharp, are also very pixelated, but I have to admit, Doom 64 looks absolutely fantastic. Now, Doom 64 is actually one of those games that's never really looked bad, but anybody that has ever played it will know that it has always been too fucking dark. I always end up pumping the brightness all the way up. Now, I know it's supposed to be a dark game, but fuck, it's almost impossible to see shit in the later levels if you don't do this. So, adding scan lines on this will darken the image even more. Now, when playing on BVMs, I have no problems with scan lines making the image too dark. To be fair, it could be the fact that my LCD does not handle blacks very well. Now, I do realize that there are OLED TVs that can display blacks better, but I just don't have that option. So by simply activating integer, I can brighten the image up considerably and still have a very sharp image despite not having scan lines.
Wait, hold on here a second. Just hold on. You mean to tell me you don't want scan lines all the damn time?
Listen, I'm simply offering a balance. I do realize some people prefer pixelated Lego Minecraft style blocky graphics, while I prefer the contrasty scan lines. But the N64 has some of the worst video quality I have ever seen. And I admit that scan lines and a D-Blur cannot always fix this. The beauty of the Ultra HDMI comes in its many options to bypass its many flaws. Whether my scan lines are too dark, the picture is too pixelated, the colors are too muddy, or the game is just too damn blurry. With the Ultra HDMI, there is always an option. But for the most part, everything but pixelation is fixed with just the deblur and integer settings. So it all comes down to just picking the right settings depending on the game. And while I prefer scan lines, I do find myself indulging in some pixelated adultery. One of the reasons I find the scan lines making the image too dark on some games is the default scan is slightly stretched. This causes a slight desaturation of color and a soft image. Once the scan lines are added, I feel the image becomes too dark on some games.
So if integer settings are so damn bright and shiny, why don't you just throw your ugly ass scan lines on top of that shit?
You know what? That's an excellent idea. I'll just, well, you gotta be fucking kidding me. Scan lines are disabled in integer? Can I ask why? I mean, I know it's possible. Check it out on integer. Hell, I even created a scanline filter for Integer Plus. So hopefully, in a future firmware update, we will get to see these settings enabled. Until then, I guess we can only dream about 5 times scanlines. But at least we have 5 times integer. And next to the fucking deblur, this is the second best option that the Ultra HDMI gives us. And since it's an integer 5 times scale, the wider display stays pixel sharp for those low-res 4-player screens. Even slightly sharper than the XRGB Mini in 5 times. And since Quake 2 does not have an aliasing filter, you cannot say this is not a fair comparison. Now, when I say slightly sharper, I mean ever so slightly. Since Quake 2 does not have an aliasing filter, it's just not that distinguishable. And at first glance, I would have thought Integer Plus on the Ultra HDMI would have been softer than my XRGB Mini settings since it's a tad wider, but yet it remains pixel sharp, unlike the Ultra HDMI's default or fraction settings. Another reason for using Quake 2 as a demonstration was to reveal that activating deblur on a game that does not have blur will not add or take away from image quality. And despite Integer Plus being slightly sharper than the XRGB Mini and wider than what you're used to in a 4x3 display, it is not stretched. For most N64 games, I actually prefer the 5 times scale over the 4 times, simply because 4 times is a windowed 960p. Now 5 times is actually scaled beyond a 1080p display and lost in the overscan just like an old CRT. Except, since it's an actual integer scale, you will get a very sharp image as opposed to simply stretching the display. Alright, so you probably know by now that when playing on the Ultra HDMI, you're really going to have to pick your poison. A blurry mess or a pixelated mess. Now while the deblur works well for the most part, there are some really stubborn games in the N64 library. The bar intro in Conkers is a great example of aliasing at its absolute worst. Now usually N64 games with heavy aliasing have 3 things in common. They're dark, almost colorless, and muddy as shit. Normally the integer plus deblur can correct all 3 at the cost of being too pixelated. But as you can vaguely see on Conkers, the image is only slightly less muddy and a tad sharper. The colors are still dull and it's only a little brighter. Yes, I do realize I can pump the gamma settings up, but as you can clearly see, it looks like shit. Now don't get me wrong, it still looks better than the blurry XRGB Mini. I just wanted to point out that there are some games that it just can't fix. And for shits and giggles, I decided to include how a high quality CRT handles this situation. I just wanted to show how a game like this was handled traditionally with scanlines and aliasing. Some of you may actually prefer this, and in this case, I know I do. Alright, let's talk about 480i. Now, of course, some of you already know I use an EverDrive for playing N64 games. What? What's wrong with playing ROMs on a real N64? It's the same fucking thing. Actually, I think it's worse when people play real carts on emulators like the Retron 5. Which to this day fucking baffles me, playing authentic carts on an emulator. Get the fuck out of here. Anyways, anyone who has ever used the EverDrive will know the menu is in 480i. Now this can be a bit of a headache when playing on the XRGB Mini. This is because it drops sync when switching between 240p and 480i resolutions.
Wait, and wait, and wait, and wait,
And yeah.
So after choosing a game on the EverDrive, I always lose sync for a few seconds. Now with the Ultra HDMI, I do not have this issue. This is a major plus over the XRGB Mini. The game just simply loads as fast as it would on an RGB monitor without any sync issues, and before you know it, you're playing the shittiest version of StarCraft. Another thing I noticed with 480i games on the Ultra HDMI was it would not implement scan lines over interlaced video. Now this doesn't bother me at all. I only like scan lines on 240p content. Anything else just seems, well, silly. Now I actually love true 480i resolution. It looks extremely sharp on my BVMs, even sharper than 240p content, and it should. After all, it's a higher fucking resolution. So why does 480i get so much hate? Well, most likely because modern LCDs have a hard time displaying it. Only CRTs and plasmas are able to display these resolutions as they were truly intended to. It's really not a matter if it's the N64's forte, but rather if it's your TV or upscaler's forte. The N64 can display a beautiful 480i image, and although limited to its graphical capabilities, 480i can provide a more vibrant image, longer draw distances, and sharper stills over 240p content. Alright, so now what I want you to do is not let those combing artifacts fool you. They are definitely not as visible in person, especially on a high quality CRT. Unfortunately, I cannot replicate the natural smoothing caused by the phosphors on my BVM with just a mere camera. I actually had to drop my capture rate to 1/30th of a second in order to record both fields in each interlaced frame, which unfortunately can also cause more combing and motion blur that would not normally be visible to the human eye. This method is not my normal routine for capturing CRT footage, as I prefer 1/60th of a second on a 60Hz set. Anyways, I just wanted to talk a bit about 480i as I just don't think it gets that much attention. It's just a hard resolution to display nicely on modern sets. And while it has its flaws, it has that same gritty charm that makes scan lines appealing to me. Okay, so now that we know there are two fields in every frame of 480i, we know the very reason for interlaced combing. So how well does this translate over the Ultra HDMI? Let's start first with fast interlacing.
Give me something to shoot.
I'm going to be quite honest, I don't see anything noticeably different here. The image still looks like pixelated dog shit. Okay, let's activate scan interlace. You know, I'm assuming this is trying to simulate interlace flicker, but I can't seem to capture the flickering. It looks like scan lines, but trust me, it's not. Alright, let's activate sharp pixels and integer plus. Whoa, easy on those pixels, that looks like shit. Let's just go ahead and deactivate deblur and see if we can soften that shit.
Give me something to shoot.
Alright, now we're cooking with gasoline. It looks good, but it needs just a dash of salt. Let's just go ahead and deactivate integer completely. Bingo! And there you have it. With a little fine-tuning, the Ultra HDMI can just about make any N64 game look good. Now, I do realize the XRGB Mini does a better job of de-interlacing 480i. However, the sync issues makes me prefer the Ultra HDMI. So anyways, let's take a look at all three options, and I want you to tell me which one you think I prefer. Alright, final thoughts. The Ultra HDMI is definitely worth the money if you love the N64. While I do see some things better playing on my BVM, the flawless scaling, deblur, and many settings makes this simply the best alternative for playing on a digital display. The downside is there are no scan lines in integer settings, and 480i has more combing than the XRGB. Anyways, as far as lag, I honestly do not feel lag on 3D games, even on the XRGB Mini. While I'm sure it's there, it's just not as noticeable as, say, playing a demonic platform on the Nintendo. There are some glitches I saw in Dr. Mario when swapping from scan lines to integer during gameplay. However, just simply resetting it would alleviate the issue. I actually hope in the future they will create an RGB version that contains the deblur function, so video purists like myself can enjoy this on a wonderful CRT.
You know, I honestly don't understand why you play on these old-ass RGB monitor contraptions when you got a perfectly good working LCD right there. I mean, come on, son, get with the times.
It was at this very moment Bubba knew he had fucked up this debate.
Oh yeah, smartass, get with the times.
And once again, Bubba had realized he had fucked up, because the NES controller is even older than the N64 controller. Now, I just want everyone to know that I'm aware of the true anti-aliasing hacks out there, and although it would be a welcome addition to this review, I felt I needed to concentrate more on what the Ultra HDMI can do. With that said, it looks fantastic on my BVM, but not so much on the Ultra HDMI. Alright, so now that we got that shit out of the way, let's move on to the next subject, the Nintendo. Definitely one of my all-time, if not my all-time favorite console. Now, until recently, the only best option we ever had was RF and composite. Nowadays, we have options to go full-blown RGB and even true digital through HDMI. This mod is simply known as the HIDEF NES. Created by Keptris, who has several interesting videos based on the project.
This is the update on the update, so added a few small features.
The simplest explanation is they were able to obtain a digital signal from the original NES and transcode it into a digital format we can output to an HDMI compatible display. Since it is digital from the console to the TV, we can assume there is no video or audio loss. It also touts zero lag and scan lines at 1080p resolutions. I have actually tested the manual lag with various results, and although it may be just a tad, it was actually not noticeable at all. This is huge, because while the XRGB Mini is fantastic, I unfortunately feel lag on my LCD, and scan lines are simply unimpressive in 1080p. Now, while I may have a great setup for CRT gaming, I am definitely shy of having something great for LCD gaming. And despite my TV's lag when using the XRGB Mini, I feel absolutely none on the HIDEF NES. And since the NES has some of the most demonic platform games ever created, having absolutely no lag is simply a must in my opinion. Scan lines, on the other hand, are similar to that of the XRGB Mini, but they are a little more pronounced, just not thick. And like I said in an earlier video, I don't mind thin scan lines on the original NES, because most games on the NES have small character sprites. Some may argue that they look unauthentic, but if you compare these scan lines to the 14N6U, or better yet, a consumer TV from back in the day, then they look pretty damn authentic. Now, if you're comparing to a 1000 line BVM, that's a different story, but that was never a consumer TV. And besides, it could be argued that the BVM does not look authentic. So despite being thin, they do get the job done. I just don't understand why they come out so thin. A 4x scale should mean a 2 pixel wide scan line. Now I know what you're thinking. It's easier to draw them over the image. Perhaps, but it's the same concept. I still have 1080 horizontal lines to deal with. So if I can do it, then the HIDEF NES can do it. The HIDEF NES has several options to stretch the shit out of the horizontal resolution to even fill the entire width of a 16:9 display. But vertical resolution is rather limited to a perfect 4x and the oddball 4.5 scale. I honestly don't see the desire to play like this, but it's cool that the option is there. But just remember, while your lines might be straight, the circles will now be ovals. Unfortunately, the 4.5 scale is your only option in 1080p to fill the entire vertical screen, which is not an actual integer scale, so scanlines will not line up correctly despite the many options to tweak them. And some of you just thought scanlines were just randomly drawn on the screen. Shame on you.
Man, hell yeah, I know I did. Shit, shut up.
You know, I honestly don't know why the 4.5 scale is even an option instead of the perfect 5x integer scale. The NES has 240 horizontal lines just like the N64. So if the Ultra HDMI can do it, then so can the HIDEF NES. Even the wonderful XRGB Mini can do 5x scale. So why is this not even a fucking option? Fuck that 4.5 scale. I mean, what's with the 50 cents? Anyways, 5x scale is simply a blessing for the NES, allowing for a perfect scale and puts those nasty NES artifacts in the overscan like they're supposed to be. The HIDEF NES does have a cropping feature that works well for the most part, but at the cost of even losing more of your 1080p display. But all this fucking cropping just makes me wish for a 5x scale. Anyways, this option even allows for cropping the left and right portions of the display for games like Double Dragon 2, which by the time I crop out all the artifacts, we are left with a bare minimum display. Alright, let's take a look at what a coulda shoulda been. And could you simply imagine if they actually had a 5x scale to go with their supposed 5x scanline filter? Kinda seems stupid to even have a 5x scanline generator with no actual 5x scale. My assumption is people who do not care for a perfect 4x integer scale will simply play in 4.5 scale since most will want to use as much of the display as possible in 1080p. Which I completely understand. Not to mention, if you choose the 4x vertical with the 5x horizontal, it's not integer either. If you scale 4 vertical pixels, you must scale 4 horizontal pixels, not 5. You can't mix and match for true integer scale. Not to mention, your circles will appear to be more of an egg than a true circle. Unfortunately, a perfect 4x integer for both vertical and horizontal gets even worse results, but we'll talk about that later. However, the non-integer 4.5 vertical with a 5x horizontal can make for nice circles despite not having no pixel height uniformity. Unfortunately, 4.5 scaling can never be used to obtain a true integer vertical scale. You cannot have any fractions or decimals in any part of the number. Whole numbers like 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth can all be used for integer scaling. This is why scanlines are simply impossible in 4.5 scale. Without a perfect vertical integer, it simply can't be done. So the question is, do you want nice circles or a perfect integer? You can't have both, at least with the HIDEF NES. If I attempt to make perfect circles in 4x vertical with all these horizontal scaling options, all you get is that stupid shimmering effect. So really, your only fucking option is 4x or 5x horizontal scaling despite all these settings. I mean, what dillhole wants to go wider than 5x when your vertical height is limited to 4 or 4.5x? In other words, quit giving us fucking options we can't fucking use. So, if you want a pixel perfect height ratio in 1080p, you will have to play in 4x since there is no 5x scale. I also want to add that I never play in 720p, as this will possibly add lag, since your 1080p will definitely use its internal scaler to scale 720p to 1080p and cause even more lag. Let the HIDEF NES, the Ultra HDMI, or the XRGB Mini do the work by always playing in 1080p. And if you have one of these, just toss it in the garbage. The TV scaler is just as good. I don't want to have to predict the fucking future to play a fucking game. Alright, so let's talk a little about integer scaling. This is actually not a new term for me, as I use this method quite a bit in photography. I use this method primarily for resizing images to a perfect pixel-to-pixel ratio in order to keep my pictures extremely sharp and without any artifacts. This concept is also how I create my own scanline filters for my videos. To give an example of how integer works, let's first use the N64 as an example. Now, the N64 typically runs at a base resolution of 320 by 240, meaning 240 vertical pixels and 320 horizontal pixels. With 240p, I tend to think of the old analog TV measurements, basically 240 horizontal lines that make up half the vertical resolution of 480 scanning lines. It's technically 525 scanning lines, but since we're talking fixed pixel displays, we'll just keep it digital. So basically what I've created here is an integer scale. Since the N64 has a base resolution of 320 by 240, this will put us right in the yellow margin as a perfect 4:3 and 1:1 pixel mapping. To get to the next integer scale, we simply multiply that resolution by 2 to get 640 by 480p. Multiplying the base resolution by 3 would then put us in the next integer scale of 960 by 720p. 4 times would then be 1280 by 960p, and finally 5 times to get an integer scale of 1600 by 1200p, which represents the integer plus settings in the Ultra HDMI. The idea is to try and match the original 1:1 pixel mapping by doubling, tripling, quadrupling, or even quintupling the pixel count. Now, if this is not done, the image will be soft because we did not match a perfect pixel-to-pixel ratio. Now here is the problem with true integer scaling on the NES. The NES base resolution starts at 256 by 240. Now I don't even need to look at this to realize that this is not going to have the same aspect ratio as 320 by 240. More like 8 by 7 than 4 by 3. The problem is a perfect 1:1 pixel map would mean that the NES resolution is really a lot thinner than you think. So the next integer scale would put us at 512 by 480p. As you can clearly see, the aspect ratio still remains the same in 480p. The next integer scale at ×3 would put us at 768 by 720p. And the next scale would put us at ×4 integer at 1024 by 960p. So now you can see why a perfect 4 times scale does not fill the entire vertical screen of a 1080p display. So when performing an integer scale all the way to ×5, we get 1280 by 1200p. This of course means linearity will not be correct despite being a perfect integer scale. This is a problem with integer scaling with the NES on a fixed pixel display. A CRT, on the other hand, would simply bloom the image. Now another route is to simply stretch the image on the LCD. This will get the job done, but the image will in fact get softer. But that's okay. You may prefer circles over a perfect pixel-to-pixel scale. The Super NES also has several games that run in 256 by 240. We normally think of the Super NES being 4:3 because of the CRT bloom we remembered back in the day. But when we play the port of Super Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Saturn, which actually runs in 4:3, it appears windowed in 8:7. Since the Saturn cannot display a lower resolution than 320 by 240, it has to run an aspect ratio of 4:3, but keep the game in windowed 8:7 since 256 horizontal pixels does not fill the entire width of 320 horizontal pixels. It may not be the game's intended look, but it's actually scaled in its true aspect ratio. It's the same concept when you run 4 times integer scaled 240p games on a 1080p display. It does not take up the entire footprint. Not following me? How about now? You know, I guess that's one way to fill those black borders, just fill it with random shit. Anyways, I'm not saying that integer is the only way to play. I actually tend to play in non-integer, but some people actually think integer is theoretical. What's theoretical about integer scaling? It's a mathematical fact. We're not talking about the fucking space-time continuum. A 4th grader can calculate perfect integer. Now, if you're talking intended look versus integer, I can see desiring one versus the other, but that's an opinion, not a damn theory. And integer scaling is anything but theory. I could also challenge whether a person would want perfect square pixels versus having a theoretical circle and rectangular pixels. Only integer scaling will provide perfect squares, especially since fixed pixel displays use square pixels. And yes, a perfect circle would be more of a theory, since technically it would be impossible to produce a perfect circle with square pixels. But nice circles is all I want. And for me, I just need a perfect vertical scale. Horizontal can be whatever it takes to get nice linearity. One question I have is, how does the TV get its instructions to bloom a low-res image? Perhaps it's just an analog thing and not a CRT thing. Or better yet, it could be a...
Damn, son, are you gonna quit lollygagging with this analog shit and come get some of this digital?
You're right, I'm trailing off.
Now, out of all that damn mumbo jumbo you just said, you're just gonna close with just saying you're okay with non-integer settings?
Listen, some people don't even care for scan lines. So I'm assuming that those guys don't want anything to do with what playing on a real CRT does, and just want the absolute sharpest picture they can get minus the CRT bloom. And trust me, integer scaling is the sharpest you can possibly get to provide that emulated look that these non-video purists seek.
Shit, I bet you hurt somebody's feelings with that emulated remark.
You fucking kidding me? Why are we playing the shitty American version of Castlevania 3?
Boy, there ain't nothing better than the American, son.
Yeah, right. Let's pop the EverDrive in and play the Japanese version. And shut up.
Am I missing something here? This music sounds like shit.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the HIDEF NES has options to activate the VR6 chip for us Americans who did not get the benefits of being Japanese.
Alright, that's enough. Them's fighting words.
Alright, man, take it easy.
Take it easy, I'll bust you upside your damn head.
It does a pretty good job emulating the VR6, but I do say the real cart sounds a hell of a lot better. There are also options to view the various sound chips in action. Oh yeah, I know what you're thinking. You see that Sunsoft 5B, and you're thinking, gimmick! Well, unfortunately, it sounds like complete shit. To be fair, it could be that you have to use a real cart, so if you just happen to have half a G to drop on one single Famicom game, go for it. I'll just wait for your review on how well it works with a real cart.
Hey, can we stop playing this old sissy-ass game and get back to some Castlevania?
This game's awesome. Whatever, man. Another cool sound feature of the HIDEF NES is the panning options. This basically lets you simulate fake stereo. In reality, it's more of a dual mono. Some people might not like it, but I'm actually a big fan of this, and even my modded RGB Famicom has a pot to adjust these settings. I guess I gotta talk about one more setting only the HIDEF NES has. Scaling. Wait a minute. There's scaling on every fucking thing. Well, it's a different type of scaling. This adds some type of software aliasing that basically smooths the jags out. I will say it's an interesting option nonetheless.
Man, that's just pretty. Alright, man, that is kinda cool.
Alright, final thoughts. The HIDEF NES is definitely the pinnacle for gaming on a digital display. Like the Ultra HDMI, it proves that a pure digital source can produce the sharpest and cleanest results even over the XRGB Mini. Yes, folks, the HIDEF NES produces a sharper picture than the XRGB Mini. even when running in non-integer, and that's fucking impressive. Not to mention, there is almost no lag at all. It is the closest thing you can get to playing on a CRT minus the bulk. I also love all the various sound options for dual mono and chip emulation. I also find that the scaling filters to be pretty entertaining and actually found myself playing various games just to see how shit would look like with smoothing. The problems I have with it are as followed. We have a 5x scanline filter and no 5x vertical scale. Despite all these horizontal options in 1080p, we have to stick to either 4x or 5x horizontal, or we get shimmering artifacts. Scan lines are too thin in 4x. No 5x vertical scale, but we have a 5x horizontal. Bottom line, give us a fucking 5x vertical to go with that 5x horizontal and that 5x scanline generator, and you're looking at the undisputed champion for digital gaming on the NES. Until then, I am not sure if it's actually a significant jump from the XRGB Mini, but it's definitely superior.